Hello everyone, this is AndresRestart, and today we are talking about how these now confirmed Nintendo Switch 2 specs are extremely exciting. Nintendo has told us some things, but their partner Nvidia has told us even more, and we've even heard from some developers as well on what they have to say about Switch 2, and it means some pretty significant things about the console and what it's capable of. In other words, we are going to see some very impressive things when it comes to the games on Switch 2, and some of the things I've already seen, I would say, are pretty impressive. And so that's what we're going to be discussing today. But before going forward, let me take this moment to point out that I am aiming to reach 50,000 subscribers by the time the Switch 2 launches on June 5th. So if you find yourself enjoying my content, I would appreciate it if you could subscribe and hit that notification bell. So in typical Nintendo fashion, when you take a look at the technical specs on their website, they don't tell us that much. Sure, they tell us about the dimensions. Yes, the console's bigger than the Switch 1, blah blah blah. But what is interesting is what they say about the screen. We have a capacitive touchscreen, 7.9-inch wide-color gamut LCD screen, 1920 by 1080 pixels, HDR10 support, VRR up to 120 Hz. So what does this all mean? So yes, the Switch 2 screen is a touch screen, just like the Switch 1. I feel like that kind of thing's pretty normal and expected by this point. But the size of the screen is dramatically larger than the Switch 1. The Switch 1 had a 6.2-inch screen, Switch 2 has 7.9 inches. Now the OLED had a 7-inch screen, which was pretty large, but Switch 2's is even more significant. However, the Switch 2 screen is an LCD screen, not an OLED screen. And we were actually having a lot of conversations about this leading up to the Direct, because the leaks did tell us that, yeah, the Switch 2 screen would be LCD, not OLED, and some people feel like that would be a downgrade from what they had with the Switch 1 OLED. But here's the thing about the Switch 2 screen. We just mentioned it is notably larger. It's also a higher resolution. The OLED screen was only up to 720p. The Switch 2 screen is up to 1080p, which will make for a significant difference. That's double the resolution. But also, the Switch 2 screen has HDR10 support, high dynamic range. This will improve color accuracy and contrast and brightness. A lot of things you look to an OLED to enjoy, this will help to bridge the gap significantly there. And perhaps what's most shocking is VRR, a variable refresh rate up to 120 Hz. This means that yes, you can play games up to 120 frames per second on your Switch 2. This includes Metroid Prime 4 Beyond. In handheld mode, you can play at 720p, 120 frames per second, or in docked mode, 1080p, 120 frames per second. And of course, in handheld mode, you still have the 1080p 60fps version, or 4K 60 in docked mode, which is also impressive, and we'll touch on that a little bit more later. But the idea that we can play Nintendo games at 120 frames per second, to be honest with you, I never really thought this would ever happen. This is insane. The level of fluidity we are going to be able to experience with this is going to be impressive. And when we take a look at technologies such as mouse mode with the Joy-Cons that allow for some really quick, precise aiming, with the improved frame rate, it's actually a really good combination. A lot of people have been remarking on this from the Treehouse demo of Metroid Prime 4 Beyond. But another thing to consider here is that because we have the variable refresh rate, games don't have to just run at 30, 60, or 120. They can vary in between. We've already heard about some games eventually hitting 40 frames per second. So imagine a game that normally wouldn't be possible at 60 FPS in handheld mode for Switch 2. Maybe eventually get like a Monster Hunter Wilds port. And so for things like this, whenever we got those impossible ports for Switch 1, the automatic default was go down to 30 FPS even though it's normally a 60 FPS game. But because of the variable refresh rate, they don't have to go all the way down to 30. They can shoot for maybe 40, which is still smoother than 30. It's not quite 60, but might be a nice happy middle ground if you can get the game looking and running well and consistently at 40. And so this is going to offer a variety of different possibilities for developers to get their game running in more ideal ways. Now here they just say that the CPU is just a custom processor made by Nvidia. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But they also make mention that the Switch 2 storage is now using UFS, Universal Flash Storage, which is dramatically faster than before. That's going to help with loading with a lot of different Switch 2 games. And we have heard that a lot of different Switch 2 games are going to be loading a lot faster than what they would have on Switch. The Wi-Fi has also been improved as well. The console will also now take microSD Express as opposed to just microSDs. These are also faster, which will be useful. However, this will also mean that you can't use your microSDs with the Switch 2. You're going to have to get a new SD Express card. Something else that is discussed is the battery life. The console approximately only runs from 2 to 6.5 hours, which is weaker than the Switch OLED, for example. But we also have access to 2 different USB-C ports now, so if you want to attach a charging bank or have it charged while you're in tabletop mode, you have a lot more options and flexibility with what you can do with the console to expand on it and with accessories and peripherals and such. So ultimately, I don't think it'll be that big of a deal, and really the 2 hours will probably be for more demanding games like open world games and such. Now, all I'll say on the dock is that they did make mention that there is a fan now, and that is going to help with performance in docked mode. It's probably why we can see games like Metroid Prime 4 Beyond running at a 4K resolution at 60 FPS. So 4K 60 is going to be a legitimate possibility for a lot of different Switch 2 games, especially when it's a developer with a great level of expertise like Retro Studios, which is really exciting because I don't think a lot of people really thought the Switch 2 could do 4K, even though we kept talking about how Nintendo's partnered with Nvidia and they would be utilizing deep learning super sampling to make this more feasible. But before I get into what Nvidia said about the console, something else I'd like to mention here is that the Joy-Cons have HD Rumble 2. They made mention of this briefly during the Direct as well. So the Switch 1 already had HD Rumble, high definition Rumble, something improved upon from typical Rumble we've experienced for many years. However, with PlayStation 5, Sony introduced even better form of rumble and feedback, and it feels fantastic. So it's nice to see that Nintendo's improved upon HD Rumble here with HD Rumble 2. I guess the question is, just how much better is it, and how does it match up to PlayStation 5? That part remains to be seen. And something else I didn't mention, they talked about in their Direct that, yeah, the Switch 2 tablet has improved audio, which, of course, is always a nice thing. But let's now dive into what Nvidia is saying about Nintendo Switch 2. They've confirmed some pretty big deals here. So, for example, AI and ray tracing for next level visuals. The new RT cores bring real-time ray tracing, delivering lifelike lighting, reflections, and shadows for immersive worlds. Now, we haven't seen too much ray tracing from Switch 2 games so far, at least from what we can tell. However, there is some speculation that perhaps at least Fortnite is utilizing a little bit of ray tracing already, which is super interesting. But Nvidia also confirms that Tensor cores power AI-driven features like deep learning super sampling, boosting resolution for sharper details without sacrificing image quality. And perhaps what gets me even more freaked out here, beyond Nvidia confirming DLSS, which will improve resolution and also is probably why we can also see some ray tracing through ray reconstruction as well. They say more power, smoother gameplay. With 10 times the graphics performance of Nintendo Switch, the Nintendo Switch 2 delivers smoother gameplay and sharper visuals. And so just hearing that the Switch 2 is 10 times more powerful than the Switch 1, I find to be extremely interesting. And just to put this into perspective, the Switch 1 is still selling for $300. The Switch OLED is still selling for $350. The Switch 2, while yes, $450 is a high price, I agree. When you think about how it is 10 times more powerful, it is a bigger screen running at 120 frames per second at a higher resolution, and we can enjoy features like AI upscaling with it through a DLSS and ray tracing, and we can see games like Metroid Prime 4 Beyond running at 4K 60 or 1080 120. Just from that perspective, it sounds pretty darn exciting. So it's nice to see Nvidia provide a little bit more details as to what exactly is going on in the Switch 2. DLSS is confirmed. It's a big part of why the Switch 2 is going to be able to do some special things. When we look at that 10 times graphical performance number there, that does put us in the ballpark of Xbox Series S. But when you think about the modern improvements, DLSS and ray reconstruction, the Switch 2 is going to be able to do some special things. As I've been harping on, Metroid Prime 4 Beyond, yeah, it's a Switch 1 game, but it looks a lot better on Switch 2. But it's not just Metroid Prime 4 Beyond. Look at Mario Kart World. This game is beautiful. It's an open Mario Kart game with so much going on. The Nintendo Treehouse has been teasing that there's still a lot more to learn from the Mario Kart Direct we'll see in a few weeks. But even just looking at the footage, it looks very impressive. I love what I'm seeing here. It's a clear dramatic improvement over Mario Kart 8. Or taking a look at Donkey Kong Bonanza. Now, there are parts about this game that I think look fantastic, and there are other parts that I think do look a little simplified. But when we take into consideration that with Donkey Kong Bonanza, like 90% of the environments are totally destructible, and it keeps record of it, and you have access to a 3D map that also keeps record of all the destruction, it's kind of mind-blowing, actually. So, Nintendo's own games are doing some impressive things here between Metroid, Mario Kart, and Donkey Kong. But what about third parties? Well, from the Direct, we already saw some games looking and running pretty well, like Elden Ring, Hogwarts Legacy. They look like pretty solid versions. I recently played through Elden Ring on my PS5, and looking at the Switch 2 version, it looks solid. But people have already gotten some hands-on with other Switch 2 games, such as Civilization 7. This is a game that's been ported over to Nintendo Switch, and the executive producer for the Civ franchise, Dennis Shirk, said a few very interesting things. He said that the horsepower of Switch 2 made the Civilization 7 graphics team extremely happy, and that also they were able to make this look like a mid-tier PC because it's got enough power. So they're comparing the Switch 2 to mid-tier PC here, and the graphics team is very happy about what they were able to do with Switch 2. And those are some very promising words, I would say. But here's also something very interesting. CD Projekt Red, they confirmed to GVG that Cyberpunk 2077 is being developed internally. The build that was running is only 7 weeks old, and they're aiming to have a 40 FPS performance mode at launch. And so this is another game that looks quite respectable when comparing it to, say, the PS5 version, for example, at least from the footage we've seen so far. And the fact that they were able to get this build of the game running so quickly, less than 2 months, and they are aiming for a 40 FPS performance mode, I think that says a lot. Because the story of Cyberpunk is one that's been a tumultuous ride. When the game launched initially, it was broken on so many different platforms. So now we're going to see a complete edition with all the DLC running well, and they were able to get it running very quickly. And we're also going to see the advantage of the variable refresh rate with a 40 FPS performance mode. The future of Switch 2 is looking extremely promising here. And I believe we are just scratching the surface, as it always goes for any next generation console. The very beginning, the first round of games, they're just getting into it, they're just learning how to understand the console, and they haven't had that much time to truly push the boundaries of what can be done. I'll even go a step further here. I've been harping on how beautiful Metroid Prime 4 Beyond looks, and I am happy that the Switch 2 version seems to have been dramatically improved. However, this is still a game that was made for Switch 1 initially. And I have my own theories on Mario Kart World and Donkey Kong Bonanza. I can't prove them, but at least with Donkey Kong Bonanza, I also think that was probably started as a Switch 1 project at one point. And Mario Kart World, I wouldn't be surprised if they strongly consider making a Mario Kart game for Switch 1, but since Mario Kart 8 Deluxe sold so well, instead they pivoted to adding DLC and focused all their efforts on making this a proper Switch 2 launch title. And so all I'm really getting at here is that while I do think these games look fantastic and I think they're doing some impressive things, they're just the first wave of Switch 2 games, and there are going to be games that will push the console even further. I look forward to seeing what Nintendo will do with 3D Mario, for example. I think that game might turn out to be the most impressive one yet. And with everything we're seeing from third parties, it looks like we're going to be able to see some pretty nice, well-running third-party games. I'm not saying we should expect them to look and run better than more powerful consoles or high-end PCs. That is not a reasonable expectation at all, but for them to be respectable and to look and run relatively well for the masses that are just okay with having a pretty decent experience at home on the TV or on the go, I think it's going to work out pretty fine. But what do you all think? Let me know in the comments below. This is AndresRestart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.